The Cold War and Withdrawal from Empire. When the Second World War ended, there was no return to the same peacetime soldiering as after the Great War. Reductions in the size of the army led to amalgamations and disbandments of many famous regiments, while unforeseen crises nevertheless required intervention, causing severe strain on those remaining. Overstretch became a familiar theme. 2 years national service, a form of conscription, was introduced to provide the manpower and ended in 1962 when the army became a regular body reinforced by the territorial army. In Europe, occupation forces remained in Germany and other former Axis areas. From 1949, these became part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, as a deterrent to the Russian threat. The wartime alliance became the Cold War. Outside Europe, unrest in Palestine continued until the creation of the State of Israel in 1949. The transition of former colonies to independence was not always peaceable. The containment of communist expansion in Malaya and Korea demanded the deployment of large forces, although fewer elsewhere. The intensity of activity between 1945 to the end of the Cold War in 1990 is demonstrated by the 1st Battalion having changed station over 30 times in that period, from the UK to Korea and other deployments in between. Many of these moves required reorganization, adopting new roles, and familiarization with new equipment. In addition, 11 emergency tours were undertaken requiring moves at short notice to some critical situation, including the Falkland Islands and Northern Ireland. Reminiscences of some who served during the period are in the website. In December 1945, the 1st Battalion was posted from India to Singapore and Malaya until January 1947, when it moved to Karachi, where it remained until the partition and emergence of the separate states of India and Pakistan. The battalion returned home, one of the last battalions to leave the subcontinent, and nearly 6 years after they had joined the Burma campaign. On arrival in Edinburgh, the 1st Battalion became the training battalion based at Dreghorn Barracks for the then 4 Lowland Infantry regiments. Meanwhile, the 2nd Battalion remained in Palestine, maintaining order between Arabs and Jews, apart from a 4-month tour in Egypt's Canal Zone. 2 of the battalion were killed during these operations. In April 1946, it moved to Malta and then, in June 1947, to Trieste as part of the occupation force in an area disputed between Italy and Yugoslavia. In 1948, they too returned to Edinburgh, where, on the 9th of February 1949, the 2nd Battalion amalgamated with the 1st as part of the reduction of the army, there no longer being any need to garrison India and Pakistan. The 7th, 9th and 8th Battalions remained in the TA order of battle. In February 1951, the 1st Battalion moved to West Germany to join the British Army of the Rhine as part of Britain's contribution to NATO. Initially in Münster and Wuppertal, arriving in Berlin in May 1952, the city occupied jointly by the United States, France, Russia and the United Kingdom. The battalion remained there until April 1953, when they transited through Glencorse before sailing for Korea. While the battalion was at Glencorse, Her Royal Highness Princess Mary, the Princess Royal and our Colonel-in-Chief, opened the regimental monument in West Princes Street Gardens. In 1950, North Korea, backed by Russia and China, invaded South Korea. The United Nations deployed forces to support South Korea, The UK contribution was the 1st Commonwealth Division, with troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand and India. The 1st Battalion sailed from Southampton on the 2nd of June, Coronation Day, the colour party having taken part in the parade in London that day. The truce in Korea held, but the battalion spent a year in the front line nevertheless. 3 of the battalion died in accidents. In June 1954, the 1st Battalion moved from Korea to the Suez Canal zone in Egypt, where, since the end of the Second World War, the Egyptians had been trying to remove the British presence by civil disorder and shootings. The battalion had to adapt from general war tactics to those of internal security. Meanwhile, an uprising broke out in Cyprus when EOKA terrorists seeking union with Greece began riots, assassinations and sabotage, followed by attacks mounted from the Troodos Mountains. In September 1955, the battalion moved at short notice to Paphos in order to restore police confidence before mounting operations against EOKA in the mountains. Private Ketchen and Lance Corporal Milne were killed during these. In July 1956, President Nasser of Egypt nationalised the Suez Canal, and in November, the 1st Battalion joined a British and French force to recover it. Although militarily feasible to regain control, United States opposition made this politically impossible, and in December, the Allied forces handed over to the United Nations and withdrew. Major David Pinkerton, who had been awarded the Military Cross for his gallantry while commanding a company of the 2nd Battalion in Hong Kong, and who had also served in Korea, was killed. Returning to Elgin in Scotland in January 1957 for a year, the 1st Battalion again moved to Berlin. While there, the Lowland regiments were ordered to replace their own cap badges with the unpopular Lowland Brigade one. At the same time, the TA was reduced in size, with the 7th, 9th and 8th Battalions amalgamating into the 8th, 9th Royal Scots. After 2 years, the 1st Battalion returned to Dundonald Camp, by Troon near Ayr. In 1960, Glencorse Barracks closed to be rebuilt as the Lowland Brigade Depot. The Royal Scots Regimental Headquarters moved from Glencorse into offices and later added a museum within Edinburgh Castle. In October 1960, the 1st Battalion was posted to Libya, British troops having remained there since 1945 at the request of King Idris in order to provide stability for his kingdom, with garrisons in Tobruk, Benghazi, Tripoli and Homs. The battalion was based in Benghazi and at Tobruk to provide security for the Royal Air Force airfield at Al Adam, and then concentrated in Tripoli, where it remained until April 1963. In the spring of 1962, however, the last national serviceman left. In April 1963, the battalion returned to the United Kingdom to be stationed at Tidworth on Salisbury Plain as part of the Strategic Reserve. They were now organised, equipped and trained for short notice deployment by air to any crisis point requiring military action. In January 1964, a company trained for 2 months in Arctic operations at Fort Churchill in Canada. In mid-May, during a battalion exercise on Salisbury Plain, a message was received ordering the battalion to move immediately by air to Aden. Tribal uprisings in the Aden Protectorate threatened the road between Aden and Dala. The road was secured, but the dissidents remained a threat, and the Radfan area of steep, high and rugged peaks had to be occupied. At the same time, 2 rival nationalist groups, encouraged by President Nasser of Egypt, began a campaign of murder and intimidation in Aden itself and its surrounding area, despite the British government's undertaking to grant independence by 1968. The battalion was complete in Aden less than 10 days from the first warning, with A Company at Thumier providing defence for the Radfan base. The next 9 months realised 4 one-month-long tours up country in the Radfan, interspersed with rest periods in Aden town, which usually involved internal security duties, urban patrolling by foot and vehicle, and little rest. Little rest there might have been, but a popular cartoonist nevertheless found time for humour. Campaign medals with the clasps South Arabia and Radfan are in the museum, and Lance Corporal McNichol was awarded the military medal. One soldier died in an accident.